Welcome to the Vanier College 11th Annual Humanities Symposium. Thank you all for attending, either online or right here in the auditorium. You guys know that if you have questions, you can come up to the mic. I've already told you that. Those of you who are at home or in your classrooms, please use the Q&A icon on the bottom of the screen to ask your questions. This year's theme is on boredom. It is the most common human experience, and yet we have had so much to say about it. We can't quite define it, and we've talked about it in all sorts of different ways. There is a lot of interest in boredom. So after 3 days, we still have much more to say about it. Before introducing our next speaker, I would like to thank a whole bunch of people and organizations that made this possible. First, the Faculty of General Education, then the Vanier College Students Association, you guys, the students who are actually watching this, you participated in making this happen. The Vanier College Teachers Association. I'd like to thank the Student Development and Services Office, Myra Grant. And then, of course, the people who have helped with just getting this off the ground, like communications, Brandon Calder, Bruce Norton, who's sitting right beside me, and his students, Michaela, Ocean, Sydney, and David. Our auditorium tech support, David and Carlos. And finally, the Humanities Symposium Committee, who have been with me every step of the way, helping me get this going. And before I introduce our next speaker, one more acknowledgement I have to make is a land acknowledgement. So we always take a moment to recognize a very important fact that we live and work and study on this land here, unceded Indigenous land. Unceded means that this land was never relinquished. It was never given up to colonial power or to the state of Canada. And this is a moment to recognize that fact and to call to consciousness that awareness that this is the injustice with which we live, and we have to continue to think about that in order. I think if it makes us uncomfortable, that fact, it is a call to action, a call to perhaps informing ourselves, learning, understanding about what that relationship really is. So we always take a moment just to say that we acknowledge that fact. So I would like now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Andrea Mihalaki. She is an assistant professor at the School of Architecture at Clemson University in South Carolina. She obtained her PhD at Virginia Tech in the School of Architecture and Design Research. Her dissertation there was on boredom's metamorphosis, Robert Venturi and Saul Steinberg. She's a licensed architect in Romania. Among her books, Dr. Mihalaki has published Dogma and Innovation in the Architecture of Sacred Spaces in 2005. And she's currently finalizing the book manuscript Metamorphoses of Boredom, Wandering, Waiting, Wondering. And that is forthcoming from the University of Virginia Press. So Professor Mihalaki examines the relationship of boredom and architecture in various publications, among which most recently, she published an article called Musings on Boredom, Mid-Century Architecture and Public Spaces. It's through that article that I actually got to know you and invited you here. I'm so excited about having you speak. So without further ado, I'll let you start. I'll let you talk about what you're going to do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for making me part of this list of really distinguished speakers. It's been a pleasure working with you, and thank you for all your hard work organizing the symposium and everyone else who has been involved. So I will share my screen and so today I'd like to propose an encounter with boredom in 7 tableaux and an epilogue. And let's see if this is actually working. So in one of the earliest references to boredom, a tongue-in-cheek first-century graffiti found in Pompeii, Italy, tedium and architecture appear ontologically related. Quote, "Wall, I wonder that you haven't fallen down in ruin when you have to support all the boredom of your inscribers. So goes the legend." End quote. Boredom as the dissociation of person from place has raised architects' interest, especially during the middle decades of the 20th century. However, most discussions on this topic have disregarded its ontological significance and instead have approached it mostly as a stylistic trope to draw attention to other issues. So the first tableau The first encounter with boredom is through the act of wandering and storing time. So, ennui, langeweile, acedia, tedium. What do we mean when we talk about boredom? And I will use these terms somewhat interchangeably, and of course, it depends who we ask. Psychoanalyst Otto Fenichel explains it as a pathological condition. Philosopher Martin Heidegger believes it is a mood conducive to philosophy. Philosopher Walter Benjamin sees it as, quote, the dream bird that hatches the egg of experience. Cultural critic Siegfried Krakauer describes it as a kind of bliss that is almost unearthly, and we can keep going. Closely observed in philosophy, aesthetics, social sciences, critical theory, literary studies, and visual arts, as we have seen over the past couple of days, boredom remains an ambiguous and barely examined concept in architectural scholarship. I am particularly interested in the middle decades of the 20th century when, as psychologist Orin Clapp has proposed, the increased use of the word boredom between 1931 and 1961 indicates a growing awareness of this particular mood in modern society. So my thesis is that the underlying theme of the interest in boredom during mid-century is a concern with time, the long while in the German Langeweile. While an architecture qualified as boring typically conjures up banality, monotony, and repetition, in other words, spatial and aesthetic features that neither arrest our attention nor absorb us in any meaningful way, I propose that this sense of discontent emerges from a temporal disengagement. Simply put, we get bored in an environment that delivers itself immediately, instantaneously, without building the anticipation and expectation of discovery. And this illustration, this cartoon from the New Yorker, is hinting at a very famous quote in architecture history, attributed to Mies van der Rohe, but that actually goes back to someone else who said, "God is in the details." So today I'd like to offer a speculative reading of an unbuilt project for a house on the Italian island of Procida, designed in 1938 by Bernard Rudowski, an Austrian-American architect, designer, writer, exhibition curator, educator, and social historian. Known primarily for his 1964 show and subsequent publication, Architecture Without Architects, which showcased vernacular and non-pedigreed architectures from around the world, which he curated at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Rudowski was a relentless critic of consumerism and the commodification of architecture. And we'll show how, we'll see how these ideas sort of unfold in his work in direct relationship with boredom. In 1955, Rudowski publishes Behind the Picture Window, a collection of essays on the nature of the modern house, which he unpacks through the activities and practices of inhabitation, from cooking, eating, and sitting to sleeping, washing, and cleaning. Written as satires, the chapters share the same goal: to expose the failure of what he calls the American way of life and propose what he has called elsewhere a new way of living, based on lessons learned from past civilizations. Summarizing the main ideas of the book, the closing chapter has an intriguing title: On Boredom and Disprivacy. I believe that boredom plays a central yet overlooked role in his critique of modernism in general and modern architecture in particular. Rudowski shows how architecture, and specifically domestic architecture, offer the means to withstand rather than fight boredom through what I'd like to call soft tactics. So the next tableau is about the genealogies of boredom in his work. So Rudowski approaches boredom from a clinical perspective. Ennui for him is the disease of the modern individual, a pathological disorder that plagues and spreads throughout the society. And this view is actually informed by the author he reads, and some of them are trained as physicians or psychologists. One of them, referenced in this chapter that I mentioned, Boredom and Disprivacy, is Martin Gompert, a Jewish-German physician who immigrates to the United States and who between 1934 and 1952 publishes several books that popularize medicine and medical figures. Among these books, The Anatomy of Happiness from 1951 is a collection of short essays that examine happiness and unhappiness from a biological and physiological perspective, providing practical advice and concrete methods to attain a state of well-being. The essays outline the medical causes of human discontent, along with physical conditions such as being sick and psychological traits such as being secretive or timid. One of the 12 aspects of unhappiness is boredom. Gompert believes that houses indicate the state of individual and collective health, and therefore the absence of privacy in modern houses points to the deteriorating health of their residents, and at a larger scale, to the declining health of the society. Key to one's happiness, privacy has become in modern times an expensive and rare commodity. Tying together ideas about boredom in habitation, happiness, and health, Gompert provides a clinical framework from the failing well-being of the modern individual. Another author who brings a medical perspective on boredom is Émile Tardieu, a French doctor who in 1903 writes an extensive psychological study on ennui, and in a notebook from the 1950s, Rudowski takes thorough notes from Tardieu's book and makes in-depth annotations on the margins. So clearly he knew the subject. Presented as an extreme psychophysiological condition, boredom for Tardieu holds a mysterious aura, and not unlike the aesthetic category of the sublime, generates intense feelings of fear and excitement, danger and appeal. Its symptoms range from visible and ephemeral manifestations such as yawning, grimaces, tics, to long-lasting and more profound effects that disturb the proper functioning of the body: sensitivity to cold, lack of appetite, weight loss, mental confusion, hallucinations, etc. Unlike Gompert, who looks at boredom mostly from a biological perspective, Tardieu establishes that boredom is a moral condition and a form of psychological distress. And he concludes with what will remain one of the underpinnings of Rudowski's own work. The ally in the fight against boredom is, quote, a modest and difficult art, the art of living well. Next tableau is going to look at boredom and the mid-century commodification of life. Now, inspired by Gompert and Tardieu, Rudowski constructs an idea that will return in his writings and design projects. As we are all more or less missing our private lives, this lack of privacy becomes one of the main sources of modern boredom. Expressed as modern boredom and disprivacy, this notion is central to Rudowski's critique of mid-century domestic architecture. He observes that under the increasing pressure of commodification and mass production, the mid-century American middle class, living in suburban housing, surrenders to the empty boredom of consumerism. While maintaining a clinical view on boredom, Rudowski both nuances and gives tangible form to a rather abstract notion. By weaving together physiological and psychological threads into specific observations about the nature of domestic practices and human habits. Since architecture is for him a way of being in the world, its ultimate goal is to nurture one's body and soul. While he's not rejecting the comforts of modern life, he calls into question consumerism and the commodification of people's everyday life, whose most damaging effect is boredom. And there's probably no other better way of showing the commodification of architecture and its transformation into sort of a product, a market product, that the advertisements in popular magazines, builders' journals throughout mid-century. And this page, as they say in ebooks, is intentionally left blank. A disease of the soul. Boredom threatens the fragile balance between the human body with its sensuous experience of the world and the human mind with its rational understanding of the world. Rudowski's implicit premise is that the split between mind and body constitutes one of the causes of modern tedium. If many of his proposals, such as to eliminate chairs, to sit and eat on the floor, to eat with our hands, to dress in flowing fabrics, to walk on uneven floors, appear impractical, sometimes naive, and oftentimes ridiculous, this is precisely their goal, to provoke. And through this provocation, to elicit a reaction from the readers who are jaded by their own acceptance of tedium. Ubiquitous in industrialized and modern societies, boredom is a state of discomfort with and alienation from the environment. Two divergent phenomena are unfolding simultaneously in architecture. On the one hand, architects and a certain public enthusiastically embrace and promote modern architecture, as we see in the famous case study houses program initiated by John and Tenza on the West Coast in the 1940s. On the other hand, some begin to question modernism's promised land of progress, comfort, and social equity that seems oblivious to the reality of segregation, suburbia, and the congestion of urban centers. Rudowski responds to the conundrums of modernism not by negating its principles, but rather by redefining the primal elements of architecture. His implicit claim is that consumerism lies at the origin of modern tedium, and that architecture, and more specifically the dwelling, is its first victim. Resistance to boredom begins with a sensuous architecture that awakens the body, resituates it in the world, and restores the broken connection with the environment. Quote, a sensibly conceived house would abrogate the need for an escape into the infantile world of packaged entertainment and the senile one of hobbies, he writes in 1938. Now, what are the specific tactics, I ask, that he employs in this endeavor of building a sensibly conceived house? And moreover, what do they tell us about architecture, embodiment, and boredom? Like other mid-century architects, Rudowski recognizes that modern architecture, and in a larger sense, consumer culture, have brought people's alienation from their places. And he offers perhaps the most unexpected way to overcome the jaded existence of the modern consumer. At a time when most architects look up above the ground to see as a prevailing mode of perceiving the environment, Rudowski looks down to feel the touch of the floor. His particular passion for floors and pavements offers a rather surprising answer to the tedium of the modern consumer. As the only surfaces that constantly engage our sense of touch, floors are never merely functional nor merely aesthetic. We rarely see them, but we always feel them. It is through floors and pavements that our sense of touch remains active, and yet, paradoxically, designers often overlook them. Floors and pavements carry an inherent contradiction. On the one hand, in order for them to function properly, they need to go unnoticed. On the other hand, as they become unnoticed, they take away our awareness of the ground. So Rudowski's attention to floors and pavements reflects, I believe, an ethical concern with defining one's place in the world. If to be bored is to lose one's place in the world, becoming aware of the surfaces we step on might reconnect us to a deeper sense of the self. And three implicit themes underlie his interest in floors. And in what follows, I will unpack each of them separately. First, floors edify our grounding in the most basic sense of growing roots, anchoring the human body and the architectural body into the earth. Second, both interior and exterior horizontal surfaces define and frame the horizon. Lastly, as the canvas against which life itself unfolds, floors construct the mood of a place by being active agents of our various practices of inhabitation. So the next tableau will be about the sort of first aspect of floors, the idea of floors as growing roots. For Rudowski, building begins with floors and walls that give human beings the ontological status of their upright posture. A wall is the bread of architecture. Building his first wall, the man became mentally a biped, wrote Rudowski, and elsewhere, he says, the floor is literally and figuratively the touchstone of a civilization. A good floor is much more than a delight to the eye. It appeals to the most sensuous of our senses, touch, end quote. In the February 1938 issue of the Italian architecture journal Domus, Rudowski publishes what appears to be an old illustration of an architecture foundational moment, which is seen in this slide. So builders have laid out in plan the foundation of the outer walls of a house and are now settling the stones to stabilize the structure. The caption states the primordial role of the floor and floor plan as the organizing forces of the building. Architecture begins with a pavement, says the caption. The architect inscribes order in the freedom of nature. The drawing also recalls ancient practices of inscribing the plan of a building at full scale onto the site itself. While in pre-modern times, the floor was the actual floor plan of the new construction, this intimate relationship has been gradually lost with the changing practices of architectural drawing. No longer viewed as an embodied footprint, but primarily as a horizontal section, today the floor plan bears little, if any, affinity at all with the architectural floor. Challenging these modern forms of representation, Rudowski explores drawings and buildings as embodied phenomena. And this is an image of another house that he designed and built in Sao Paulo in Brazil, where the floor plan really captures and indicates the liveliness of the activities, textures, landscape that happens on the ground floor. The surface of the page, the surface of the building floor, and the surface of the site itself become one, and thus the pavement acquires an ontological role. In a disenchanted world that is increasingly perceived through the mediated experience of the new media, rediscovering the primeval sense of touch is not just a nostalgic longing for an idealized mythical time. It suggests that architecture still has the potential to anchor us into the world and connect us with each other within the horizon of a specific culture. Connected through the intimacy of the soul, feet and floors are inseparable in Rudowski's work, and he celebrates this relationship also in footwear projects. Originated in 1946, the line of Bernardo's sandals makes manifest the bodily awareness of the horizontal plane. Designed to accommodate rather than constrain the anatomy of the foot, the sandals aspire to remain timeless pieces, comfortable and wearable outside fashions and fads. Building upon the multiple meanings of the Italian word pianta, Rudowski notes the attraction between the sole of the foot, la pianta del piede, that caresses the soul of the house, and also its plan, la pianta della casa. And he establishes an affinity between the plan of the house and the materiality of its pavement. Only on a good plan one can make a good pavement. In 1938, Rudowski publishes also in Domus drawings of a project for a house on the island of Procida, off the coast of Naples. Titled "What We Need is Not New Technologies, but a New Way of Living," the article constitutes, as Rudowski himself will acknowledge later, the kernel of half a dozen books on architecture, apparel, and related matters. Designed for a piece of land that he and his wife had bought on the island, the project, although never built, is Rudowski's manifesto about the ideal dwelling. A harmonious encounter between architecture and lifestyle, the ideal home eliminates the unnecessary prosthesis of consumerism, seeking an unmediated relationship between inhabitants, nature, and man-made design. Although designed in a modern vocabulary, the house challenges modern assumptions about function and program. While different rooms are designated through conventional nomenclature, living room, dining room, bathroom, etc., the project describes and responds to the activities taking place in these spaces, which are shown in unconventional forms of architectural representation. The boundary between indoors and outdoors is blurred not through the modernist trope of glass walls, but through practices of occupation of space. People's movements between inside and outside are choreographed through the materiality of walls and floors. In a subtle play of scales and textures, the project transforms furniture into architecture and architecture into furniture. Considering them superfluous, Rudowski eliminates the dining table, the desk, the night table, the kitchen table, and the bathtub. Having the entire floor made of mattresses, the whole bedroom, for instance, becomes an oversized bed, not unlike Japanese rooms covered in tatami, where one can only walk barefoot. At the same time, the mosquito net hanging from the ceiling that we see here in the image and hovering above the entire room evokes both a baldachin and an archetypal primitive hut. In Rudowski's theory of inhabitation, there is an essential distinction between washing, as the modern utilitarian act of removing dirt, and the bathing as an ancient ritual or a form of cultivated leisure. This separation is expressed in the house by placing in different spaces the toilet and the sink, as we see here, and separately the bathtub. And in fact, the bathroom becomes a bathtub. Dipping into the ground, the floor carves out the bathtub from the ground plane itself, thus creating an intimate relationship between the body of the bather and the earth itself. The patio, right in the middle, with its natural pavement of grass, daisies, violets, and orchids, is the true living room of the house, which itself grows from the floor plane. A tent in the summer and a fireplace in cold weather allow for year-round inhabitation. Firmly anchored into the ground, the body of the house and the bodies of its inhabitants make sense of their place in the world. Boredom, as the dissociation of people from their places, is transformed through the everyday rituals of inhabitation enacted on the horizontal planes of the house. Next tableau on building horizons. Architectural theorist David Leatherbarrow observes that the fluid spaces of modern architecture need to be understood not as a function of walls, which begin to disappear. Instead, spatial conditions should be studied in relation to floors, which he calls levels or horizons, planes of reference, or more fundamentally, of existence. And moreover, sections rather than plans reveal the multiplication of levels that did not exist in pre-modern architectures. And examples such as Rudolf Schindler's King's Road House or Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water create spatial differentiation through horizontal planes that float, meander, move, and undulate, thus offering what the modern dissolution of the walls has eliminated, which is the complexity of spatial experience. Now, Leatherbarrow's observations offer the lens to look at Rudofsky's work, which tacitly makes present these horizons of inhabitation. The sketches for the porch of the house show how the floor plane bends to become a bathtub, carved out from the ground, and then becomes the nest for a tree in the center of the living room patio, as we see in this drawing. People are shown laying down or sitting directly on the floor, thus reenacting the most intimate contact with the earth. Similar to a Roman triclinium, an assemblage of 3 stones with a slab of marble in the middle replaces conventional chairs and tables, which not only remove people from the comforting proximity of the ground, but, Rudofsky warns us, also cause poor digestion, stomach aches, and an unaesthetic belly. So all these problems that chairs and tables are causing. In 1950, Rudofsky and his friend, the Italian-born sculptor Constantino Nivola, built together a series of interventions in the spacious yard of Nivola's house in Amagansett, New York. The project, which is modest in size, consists just of a few outdoor walls, a solarium, a pergola, and a fireplace. And these 2 images are actually from a couple of years ago, so the project has gone through some transformations in the meantime. An aperture in a freestanding wall that we see here in the image on the left is deliberately opened in the original project to allow a tree branch to go through, a playful condition captured in a photograph that Rudofsky reproduced in several publications. In the meantime, the tree has died, but the opening is still framing a very specific view of the garden. And these are in fact period photographs from this intervention. A sunroom accessible through a ladder only from above creates a room open to the sky, separated from the environment, yet still part of it. Condensed to elemental pieces, vertical and horizontal planes, architecture becomes not an end in itself, but a means towards celebrating nature and timeless rituals of wholesome living. Another key element of the design is the presence of the sky. Quote, "The spectacle of the forever changing sky can be enjoyed only outdoors. One has to contemplate the sky not in a shapeless garden, but rather from within 4 possibly white walls that form an edge as defined as a picture frame," end quote. And this gesture of delineating a slice of the sky to bring it closer, which James Turrell will kind of reinterpret later in his sky spaces, is a way of defining and making sense of the horizon. In Rudowski's houses, floors and walls build horizons of inhabitation. Domesticity is neither routine nor fashion, but rather a ritual that, once established, is performed over and over again without the constant need for change. The emergence and frequency of the terms and concepts we employ indicate implicit concerns underlying our everyday lives, as well as broader societal and cultural anxieties. And an example is the word boredom, which apparently enters the English vocabulary only in the 18th century, not because the phenomenon did not exist before, but rather because around this time, as Elizabeth Goodstein notes, a form of reflective distance becomes a new attitude towards experience altogether. Similarly, today we observe an increased frequency of the concepts of atmosphere or mood in architecture, not because architecture has not been concerned with this in the past, but rather because a certain discontent with our current experience of the environment is prompting us to seek answers outside the tangible and the measurable. A sign of our disenchantment with the quotidian, it speaks about the increasing dissatisfaction with everyday experiences constantly mediated through screens and simulated realities. Commenting on walls and floors in ancient Roman rooms, Rudowski writes, quote, "Stone mosaic, marble slabs, stucco reliefs, mural decorations were employed to establish a mood particularly conducive to spiritual composure," end quote. He conceives of the horizontal space of the floor as an opportunity to construct moods and atmospheres. Architects rarely imagine the floor as instrumental in creating moods, yet Rudowski assigns to pavements the role that walls play in defining the character of a room. Quote, "Do you know the Faun House in Pompeii?" he writes. "Here we understand why the Pompeians who inherited the Greek culture could easily give up the frescoes. They had paintings of profound beauty on the floor," end quote. So he suggests that the banal horizontal plane has the unexpected potential to generate spiritual dispositions and celebrates it as the most noble part of the house. Habits and embodied practices are central to Rudowski's ideas about domestic architecture and constitute the framework from which emerges the atmosphere of a place. Moreover, the orchestration of different horizontal levels, their materiality and textures, draw attention to the pace of a place, the way it is experienced and lived. Boredom, as the malaise of modern individuals stifled under the excess of consumerism, vanishes once they engage with their environment. Floors and pavements play an active role in this interaction. In all of Rudowski's projects, the ground plane receives special attention through textures and specific indications of materials, which suggest specific modes of inhabitation. And I will turn once again to the approach of the house, where these intentions become manifest. So the project really chronicles a way of living. The plan view is where these practices of inhabitation are enacted, and the floor plane reveals the temperament of each room. A rather unusual drawing, this view combines an architectural plan as a horizontal section with depictions of people and mythical characters. Wrapped in loose fabrics, various figures engaged in domestic activities are projected against the surface of the floor, which itself becomes one of the main actors in the complex orchestra of the house. Dominating the image in the center, a dark-skinned female silhouette represented in an Egyptian profile pose, perhaps the lady of the house, occupies the central patio. Spread throughout the spaces surrounding the courtyard, other characters narrate the living practices of the household. Situated at the top left corner, the entryway is the space of the ancella, an Italian word that designates an apprentice. And this person is actually shown laying on a low deck chair overlooking the pathway. From here, one has the option of moving either toward the kitchen, which is actually fully electric and modernized, or toward the bathing area, preceded by kind of ablution space. So more than practical activities, these acts are rituals that situate the individual in a horizon of existence bound to a particular place and a particular community. In vividly depicted scenes, male and female characters interact with each other as well as with real and mythical creatures and inanimate objects spread around the rooms. A winged horse is trotting graciously, while deer are gliding from space to space and birds are hovering in the air. While some inhabitants are feasting in the dining room, others are playing the piano or the harp in the music room. A couple are bathing leisurely in the bathroom. Profiles of mythical figures emerge as muses of different spaces. Holding a bow and arrows, a fearless Diana stands naked in the courtyard. And we see her like right here in the center. So what are we to make of these domestic scenes? The story is not complete without the last pages of the article. A photograph of a model of the house, here in the center, is placed next to close-up photographs from the Procida island itself. In a cinematic twist, the drawings from the previous pages come to life. Fish, boats on the shore, people, light filtered through tree leaves. We understand that the intentions suggested in the planned drawing reflect the reality of the island. The sailing curtain hovering in the courtyard has its counterpart in the floating fabrics of the fishermen. The architectural elements, textures, light, and air rendered in the project are part of the actual landscape. The lady of the house materializes as a mysterious woman whose right and left foot, that we see up here, step on the left and respectively right page of the journal spread. Wearing open sandals, the woman's feet are photographed on a grass bed with flowers. All these fragments constitute the tabella delle materie prime di Procida. So this term is a pun between tabella di materie, or table of contents, and materie prime, or resources. And this is a collection, really, this collection is an inventory of resources, physical, such as stuff, mosaic, wood, but also experiential, a mule walk on the shore, grocery shopping, the beach that one encounters on the island. The Procida house proposes a model of inhabitation that is both real and ideal. The ground plane is the canvas against which life itself unfolds. The visual field of the photographs from the island closely frames either floors of different natures or views of the sky, thus implicitly building the horizon of the place. Naturally emerging from this symphony of materials, colors, smells, and tastes, and intertwined with century-long practices of inhabitation, the atmosphere of the place offers the most ordinary forms of resistance to modern boredom. Neither an optimistic cheer nor a fully mechanized environment, this mood accounts for everything that is human. At the same time practical and poetical, the house is firmly anchored in its place, yet inhabiting another magical and mythical dimension. The new way of living, urged in the article title, proposes to reposition modern individuals in close contact with the phenomenal world. Consumerism engenders a tedium that devours time, and Rudowski's nostalgia for a pre-industrial society is more than anything a nostalgia for time as embodied duration rather than instantaneity. While he idealizes a far from perfect world, he presents architectural ideas whose ultimate goal is to slow down time. The floor is the architectural element with the immediate potential to make people tarry and linger as they move through space. The most inconspicuous, yet the most direct in its engagement with the body, the floor constructs the physical measure of our pace. By slowing its pace down, the body readjusts to its environment. So what is at stake in this emphasis on horizontal plane is the awareness of time as embodied experience, particularly relevant at a moment when architecture is mainly concerned with space. An outcome of an increasingly mechanized environment, boredom threatens to alter human beings' most intimate connection with their world. And the architecture of the house, Rudowski proposes, has the agency to reposition this relationship and resist everyday ennui. Lastly, our last tableau is the house as an instrument for living, as Rudolsky defines it. A relentless critic of consumerism, he foresees the commodification of architecture and proposes forms of resistance through design. Closely related modernism, consumerism, modern leisure, boredom threaten to corrupt the essence of the human being, and both the problem and its key begin at home. And just to read the last part of this quote, in order to keep our slender hold on sanity, we must gain a better perspective of our priorities. The house has to become again what it was in the past, an instrument for living instead of a machine for living. And here he's directly criticizing Le Corbusier's famous trope that the house is a machine for living in. Now, is there a place for boredom in today's architecture? Now, as the production and obsolescence of images becomes ever faster with new technologies, I believe that the conversation about boredom remains critical in contemporary architectural practice. Quickly saturated with information presented in fleeting displays that are easy to produce, easy to delete, and easy to consume, as soon as our expectation for novelty and change fails to satisfy us, we fall back into the loop of boredom. So perhaps exercising our ability to assume boredom as a lengthy form of introspection might offer unforeseen avenues to engage with the immediate world. And without specifically conceptualizing their work through the lens of boredom, a number of architects and designers cultivate and elevate the ordinary, the embodied practices of everyday life, in the more conscious engagement with time. Just a few examples, the work of the Spanish architect Alberto Campo Baeza seems a stubborn exploration of white boxes. However, from their extreme asceticism and formal modesty emerges the exuberance of material and spatial experiences. Every project is a carefully constructed narrative, joining inhabitants, landscape, materials through the body of the house. The photographic essays that accompany each project systematically include the silhouette of a woman coming into or walking outside the frame. Techniques of visual storytelling articulate the embodied experience of the house. Starting in 2006, Japanese designer Naoto Fukasawa and British designer Jasper Morrison have curated several shows under the title Supernormal. Displayed on neutral white boxes, the objects exhibited come from different generations and periods, but share the same quality: unsensational objects of the everyday, from paper clips, waste baskets to grills and bicycles. Commenting on our contemporary assumption that normal has become the equivalent of boring, the designers make an argument for ordinary objects that perform just as they should, naturally. The implicit statement is a critique of the interesting, of those seductive things that attract attention yet remain superficial, loud, and ultimately arbitrary. Beauty and meaning, as Fukasawa and Morrison imagined them, are not inherent to forms or shapes. They are found instead in the relationships between people, objects, and time as lived presence. Lastly, British architect John Paulson operates within this thick space where boredom folds into meditation. And usually described as minimalist, his architecture recovers the simple and unassuming qualities of mundane forms and objects. His designs are built around the activities and events of their inhabitants. And his work embraces the simple and elegant joys of the everyday. He confesses, "I do sometimes think, what's next after architecture? One's always trying to make the work better, but I don't know, maybe something different. I have a very low boredom threshold." He continues to work, he was originally trained as a photographer. He continues to work with photography as a means of conveying moods and atmospheres. "I like the everyday. I rarely photograph the spectacular view. Capturing small moments makes me feel less anxious and about missing things," end quote. So over the past 2 years, between anxiety and boredom, fear and carelessness, anger and defeat, despair and hope, we all learned to live 1 hour at a time. Between lamenting the past and dreading the future, time both dilated and contracting. contracted, leaving only the certainty of the bare present. Day after day, month after month, as the world was shrinking, the intensity of our feelings and emotions kept expanding. Trapped in the digital realm, we all took whatever figments of reality were permitted. In a dissonant world where nothing made sense anymore, we suddenly confronted the infinity of time, thus becoming aware of our own finitude. So quoting Walter Benjamin, is it possible, I ask, that, quote, boredom is the threshold to great deeds? And I will leave you with this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that interesting and unique perspective. James Dankert sends his regards here. It's really, this is such a unique way of looking at the question of boredom. We haven't heard anything like it so far. So it's really something new to our discussions here. As people get ready to put forth some questions, get together some questions, I'll start with you, if you don't mind. I'll just start and ask you to tell us a bit about your own trajectory, how you came to study boredom through the lens of architecture, because you've said so many interesting things. I don't know where to start, but I mean, how did it, when you talk about architecture and you talk about its effect on us, how we live and how we are our own well-being, it's something that I'd never really thought about, and it was new when I came across you. It was something new to me. So can you talk to us a little bit about your own experience and how you came to that?
Sure, I love to, because it's actually a pretty interesting experience. So while I was working on my PhD, and I was really trying to determine or find a particular topic that interested me, I was very interested at the time in the relation of architecture and travel, and how ideas, people move from one place to another, and how in this process of translation, kind of innovation happens, right? So I was reading various books, and completely by accident, we'd probably call it serendipity, a happy accident, I came across a book written in the 19th century, 18th or 19th century, by a Prussian officer who was confined to a 40-day arrest in his room in the aftermath of a duel. So the author is Xavier de Maistre, and the book was called Voyage Around My Room. So I came to this book primarily because of my interest in travel and voyages. And I think very early, so the book is essentially a satire, a critique of the grand tour of the 18th and 19th century, when young aristocrats were kind of traveling to Italy, France, and Greece to see the ruins of antiquity. So what he proposes, as he's being confined to within the four walls of his room, he proposes that there is another type of voyage at a different scale that involves more of a sort of a personal experience and a contemplation of the small everyday moments that surround us. And I think it's on the very first page of that, of his different stories. So the book is structured in 40 chapters, with each chapter dedicated to one of the days that he was confined into his room. And on the first, I think it's the first page in the first chapter, he says something about boredom that can actually opens up as you travel from your chair to your desk, to your bed, as you look through the window and watch the sunrise or the sunset. Boredom kind of envelops you, but it's a boredom of a contemplative nature. And that to me was incredibly interesting. It was the first time that I sort of came to realize that there is something that boredom and contemplation or meditation might have something in common. And this was completely new to me. I had no idea whether there is anything in architecture that could be related to that, neither in the other fields. So that was the beginning of my personal journey. And I came to realize that boredom was actually a huge topic of discussion in philosophy, in visual arts, sociology and psychology, obviously, visual arts in the mid-60s, with all the with minimalism and conceptual art, and also the emergence of pop art, were directly engaged in this conversation about boredom. How do we create an experience of the artwork through boredom? So in a way, this sense of deliberate disengagement makes us aware of a particular experience of the work, right? So it took me a while to sort of understand whether there is anything about that is tied into architecture. And again, little by little, I came to discover that there were, in fact, there's quite a remarkable number of architects, particularly during mid-century, which I think is quite interesting, that became interested in the topic of boredom or wrote about boredom without always instrumentalizing it into an architectural process. But in a way, that was, I think, my task, like trying to unpack how perhaps some thoughts that were subconscious or unconscious were materialized in particular architectures. And I came to Bernard Rudofsky fairly late, actually, after I wrote my dissertation. And my dissertation revolved primarily around Robert Venturi, who is considered sort of the father of postmodern architecture, who famously retorted to Mies van der Rohe's "less is more," which is a motto that probably that has become part of popular culture. So Robert Venturi retorted to Mies van der Rohe's motto by saying "less is a bore." And again, this is something that is that has never been examined because it's considered kind of a commonplace or something has never been taken seriously. But again, I came to realize reading between the lines and even actually reading the lines that Venturi himself was interested in this topic of boredom during mid-century. So, in a very long, very long answer to a really good question.
I mean, there's a lot in that. I mean, introducing architecture in this discussion on boredom is something that it's eye-opening for me. And you said a lot of things, and so I think it's worth repeating or maybe re-explaining some things that have to do with how the space around us affects our mental health, in particular in the context of the last 2 years that we have been very much within our own space. And you've talked about it a bit. I wonder if you can just go over this idea. What is the relationship between mental health and that physical space that surrounds us, especially in this modern era where you talked about the separation from nature as well? I mean, it's come up during this week that nature is an answer to or an antidote to depression. I think that was Sandy Mann yesterday morning. So talk a bit about that, nature, mental health, and the space around you and how we live in it.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually, there are multiple studies in neuroscience and architecture that talk about this connection. And there is, now we have scientific evidence that shows the impact of nature, like just simply the view of nature on our mental health. And again, going back to my own research, I think what I came to understand, although I started studying mid-century architecture, what I came to understand is that this topic of boredom is probably even more interesting or more relevant today than it was during mid-century. And this is not only because of our lack of contact with nature, but also because of the types of life that we live today. We are constantly, our experience of space, of reality, is mediated through screens. And this sort of constant exposure to a mediated reality makes us lose the sense of touch with concrete, immediate, and with the phenomenal world. And one other danger I think that exists in the virtual world that we're all witnessing is this constant ability of things to change, to become new and newer again, right? So as our attention span shortens, our ability to focus on something for more than a few seconds disappears, right? And art is directly part of this. If we walk through like all these new developments, there is nothing that arrests our attention. There is nothing that makes us stop and wonder about what is there. Everything is immediate, everything is direct, and everything is sort of obvious, right? Like there is no, architecture doesn't require us any kind of engagement. And this is why I introduced this topic of time, because I think, and again, the relationship of boredom and time is nothing new, but I think it's particularly relevant in architecture if we understand the perception of space through this idea of time, rather than just sort of the spatial experience. So in other words, if we are in a space that sort of delivers itself immediately, that doesn't incite our curiosity or our sense of wonder, then we get bored. We get bored and we expect something else. We expect something new. Whereas another type of, or whether spaces that engage our phenomenal body, that architectural spaces that we can touch, smell, engage the other senses, not just the sight, I think help us sort of create a healthier relationship with ourselves and with the environment, and I think with other people. So again, I think there's something really, really important in understanding how space and mental health and our overall well-being are deeply connected, and the role that boredom plays in these interactions.
Okay. Bruce, are you going to take the microphone to ask?
No, I'm going to see if anybody else up here has any questions.
Okay, well, I have a question. It's actually from Bruce. Okay, okay, go ahead. If you want to go ahead, Ingrid.
No, you go.
Oh, okay, so while Bruce is looking around, I see that he has a question. I'll read it out. It's from, oh, no, I'm sorry, it's not from Bruce. It's from, oh yes, I have one from Bruce and then I have another one.
Okay.
What are some of the elements or influences from Rudowski we might recognize as common in our spaces and architecture or ways of living today?
That's a good question. I would probably say that Rudowski is really not known for what I presented today. Rudowski is primarily known for introducing the ideas about vernacular architecture into the discourse of contemporary architecture. So vernacular architecture is, vernacular architectures are those architectures that are not designed by architects, are the architectures of the so-called primitive societies or traditional societies, right? Where there's no designated figure of the architect. So in 1964, when he curated the exhibition Architecture Without Architects at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, that was not his first exhibition, and it was not the last one that he curated. However, this is what he remains, he's known in architecture history for that particular moment. And I would say that, so it was for the first time, at least during modern times, that someone was looking not at designer architecture, at authorship, at authored architecture, but instead at what he called non-pedigreed architecture. And of course, today, this is nothing new. We're all kind of relearning the lessons of past civilizations, the lessons of vernacular architecture, but at the time, that was quite a groundbreaking moment. Now, I think if we put that moment into kind of a larger, if we situate it in a larger picture, I think it's also part of Rudowski's way of understanding architecture, not through shapes or forms, but through habits and modes of life. Because in all of his writings, projects, exhibitions that he curates, he's constantly positioning architecture as sort of one aspect of life in general. And it can never be disconnected from the way we live, the way we dress, the way we eat, the way we interact with each other. So architecture is just another aspect of our relationships between ourselves and with the world at large. So I would probably say that's the something that perhaps has sort of trickled down from his time to today. But this whole conversation about the boredom, I think, is something that hasn't really been tackled, which is why it sort of interested me.
Okay. Okay, I have something else here. I have a question from one of our attendees. Can you, and this is quite interesting, hang on a second. Can you relate lack of privacy to boredom, and also explain how it doesn't contradict itself when building open homes invites invasion of privacy? Shall I?
Yeah, I think I can see it, and I can see the question.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much. So what I found interesting is that Rudovsky introduces this notion, kind of comes up with makes up a new word, disprivacy. So he talks about boredom and disprivacy. So the disprivacy that he's talking about refers specifically to this moment that begins in mid-century architecture, which is this idea of staged domesticity. So one's house is not just their own private domain, becomes a stage set that is displayed and showcased to the world. And the architectural element that facilitates this display is the mid-century picture window. So the collection of essays that I talked about at the beginning is actually called Behind the Picture Window, because the picture window, which is no longer really, I asked my students the other day, do you guys know what a picture window is? And nobody really knew what I was talking about. But at the time, during mid-century, it was a very, very common term. And it designated really a house. It came to be advertised as sort of the relationship between the house and the exterior. It was that particular feature that made your house modern. So the picture window designated was advertised, really. So some of the advertisements that I showed in the presentation were advertisements for a picture window. So a mode of, again, displaying a modern lifestyle. So the picture window, number one, designated a lifestyle, and number two, a modern lifestyle, and number two, sort of conveyed a certain relationship between interior and exterior, where people would sort of carefully craft what is seen through the picture window, because you can look from the inside to the outside, but you can also, people from the outside can look into your house through that picture window, right? So when Rudovsky talks about this privacy, he's sort of unpacking like all these features of mid-century houses that in fact are conducive to this source of this kind of lack of privacy. And this privacy for him, I think, also relates to something else, the nature of our relationships with the others. So in the houses that he designs, in his writings, he's also interested in this idea, in the idea of conviviality. So how people live together. And in a way, this lack of privacy, it's paradoxically also conducive to a lack of meaningful relationships with the others, with the community. Like in a way, you are sort of all by yourself in your exposed private, so-called private living room. So it's almost like a contradiction in terms as the person in the audience noted. So another thing that I think it's important, again, why are we even talking about Rudovsky, a mid-century writer, architect, designer in the 21st century? I think this conversation about the nature of the house is also really important today. So we tend to talk about, there's this tendency of minimizing our carbon footprint, minimizing the footprint of the house. There is a whole conversation about tiny houses. But what I think what misses in this conversation is precisely the idea of conviviality at home. Most of our actions of getting together, which are called, with a term that I hate, entertainment, oftentimes happens outside the house. Whereas, so we meet with our friends at a restaurant, we meet with our friends at a bar, but at least in certain parts of the world, there are fewer interactions that happen at home between people at home, right? So I think what is really important in what Rudovsky proposes is actually the idea that an essential part of dwelling, of living, of inhabitation is the notion of conviviality at home. And so privacy and intimacy with your friends, with your family, that happens on the territory of the home. And again, sorry for a long
No, that's okay. It's really
long
great question.
explanation.
Okay, well, I guess we'll go to this question then about what happens when we begin to visit each other regularly again. And it's interesting because you were talking about how most of our socializing doesn't happen at the home. Well, not in my case, but what does it mean after, like, COVID? Do you think, the question is, do you think there will be a need for new forms of architecture? Will the old theaters and public spaces be good enough for post-COVID communal life? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you can tackle that.
Well, I think these are really, really good questions. And my personal fear, and I'm not sure whether we actually have a resolution, but based on what has been happening, again, at least in the United States, we have all seen yet another flight from the cities. So just as during mid-century, there was the so-called the white flight, where the white middle class deserted city centers and moved into the suburbs. During COVID, we've seen that so many people chose to abandon, let's say, their urban residences and retire somewhere in the countryside, whoever had the means to do that, and so on and so forth. So that immediately created this sort of inequalities, obviously class inequalities and racial inequalities between categories of people within the city. And my personal fear, and again, I don't know that I have an answer to that, was that in a way we are reliving the urban flight, the white flight from mid-century. In other words, just when we were starting to re-inhabit our city centers and our urban areas, and just when we were trying to kind of get reaccustomed with urban spaces, people are now fleeing the city again. So where are we going? I don't know. It was interesting also to notice that perhaps middle-sized cities became more enticing, more interesting to people than large-sized cities, precisely because they were able to offer this kind of like a happy medium, let's say, between urban life and nature, for instance. So I don't know. I do hope that old theaters and public spaces will continue to exist. And I think we're all kind of missing being together in the phenomenal world, not just in the virtual. But I guess that will be something to see.
Yes. Okay. I think we have time for one more question. I'm just going to go to the audience again to make sure. Ingrid, did you have something?
It's not so much a question as just, I guess, a reflection. And I don't know if maybe you have something to say to that, but I go every year to Europe, or pretty much every year, because I'm from there. It's my family lives there, then I go traveling, then I come back. And when I come back, I'm always really taken every time. I know the drill. I know what Montreal looks like from above. So every time I come back, I'm like, oh my God, it's so ugly. I'm sitting on the train and I'm looking down at the city and I'm already depressed. And I get out and I see all these big box stores that are either brown or gray, and I see the streets that all are cookie cutter, talking about a mass society and mass production and mass housing in that sense. And this utter lack of imagination. After we've been to Florence or something, this is a really bitter pill to swallow. And I know, of course, Florence is, its own special thing, but still, and then I'm always wondering, couldn't we put a bit more effort into this and actually make life a bit more worthwhile just by surrounding ourselves with beauty and just using pastel colors instead of browns. And so I'm very open to this idea that, you know, we should change the way we do things in that regard, and we need to move away from that consumerism. But when we were talking about Rudolsky and presenting his vision, I was just wondering if it isn't a bit overly romantic. I mean, I'm also kind of afraid of architecture as a concept and architecture as a lived-in experience, in the sense that sometimes I see something created by an architect and I hate it. And somebody tells me how great it is, and I feel completely uncomfortable in that space, and I'm wondering why anybody can live in it. And so there's this story attached to this architectural work that is supposed to make it beautiful, but it doesn't feel beautiful to me, or interesting, or comfortable. And so Rudolsky, I haven't seen his work, and some of the ideas I think are really great, but then there's certain aspects, and it's the no chair thing. I mean, as soon as you get older, since my 40s, I've had a knee problem. I mean, for me, this would be hellish if I had to get up from the floor every single time, you know what I mean? So just from a practicality point of view, even the sandals, again, I need orthotics, you know, in my shoes. And you see the sandals that are actually really modern again now, but they would be a nightmare for me, you know? And so I'm not so enthusiastic about this one architect's vision who sort of gets celebrated. And I'm just wondering how you feel about that, whether you also feel some kind of apprehension about this grand visions, or how we should approach that, or if there's a solution to this, or maybe you could comment on that, you know?
Thank you. It's a really good observations. And the first thing that, thank you, Bruce, for facilitating that. I think what the first thing that comes to mind is that there really is a disconnect between architects and what we unfortunately do very often in the real world, and how our profession and what we do are perceived. And I guess, I don't know. It's a big question. So how do we? I guess it comes to how we educate our students. And again, if everything that matters is understanding architecture as a consumer's product, which unfortunately is what is happening today. If we look at all the new developments, whether housing or public spaces or public buildings or whatnot, it's really what prevails is the commodification of architecture. And of course, it's not easy to sort of counteract that, but I think there are sort of soft tactics, this kind of quiet forms of resistance. And at the end of the day, it probably depends on architects and on architects' own consciousness and talent and desire to sort of take one path or the other. I'm not entirely convinced I answered the question, but I'm glad to hear. I was glad to hear the observations, and yeah.
That's okay. We have more questions, but I'm afraid I have to let our students go to their next class because they're due for their next class. I'm really sorry. I thank you very much for your presentation. It was a fascinating talk. You gave us lots to think about, and I look forward to reading more that you've written.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, and I look forward to the rest of the other events in the symposium.